Hey, Karie.
Hi, Kim.
So I have a question for you. Why are we talking about strategy so late in the content and commerce discussion here?
That's a great question, Kim. And I think as much as we want strategy to be something that companies lead with, the reality is that so many commerce organizations that are really looking at digital commerce are very focused on the technology, and we have a very hard time getting them to really get into that strategy mode. And so the series kind of felt like, let's just roll with what we often face and let's put strategy where it often lands when we're having those conversations. So that's
It's
why
true.
strategy is falling late in this series.
It is true. And it was a little bit of a baiting question there because I know, Karie, we always talk about, we use this phrase strategy without execution is a daydream, but execution without strategy is a nightmare. And I know we very frequently, like you're saying, get to almost the tail end of a project and somebody, a stakeholder, a leader, a C-suite member will say, wait a minute, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? How do we measure success? How am I going to talk about ROI to my board? And unfortunately, a lot of times we've been brought in too late to that conversation to have good answers, and we end up circling back and saying, those are great questions. Let's help you answer those and make sure we really can leverage, like you're saying, the technology you've selected. And inevitably, that opens up a whole other conversation around it was just the technology. It's a great enabling technology typically, but do you have the right teams? Do you have the right processes? Do you have all the right assets when it comes to content? How have you started thinking about management and governance and all of that? And I think sometimes we talk about strategy as being a little bit of a dirty word, or a
Right.
lot of times we're like, no, 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 we don't want to talk strategy. That sounds too high level or too fluffy.
Too fluffy.
But I think yeah, but I think we've seen a trend of more companies thinking strategically. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, I can't tell you how many companies, large companies, right? Like very large companies, that when we tried to have those strategy conversations really shut us down, right? And it's
Yeah,
interesting
right.
how many of them are coming back and saying, we selected the right technology, like we selected the best technology on the market. We really
Right.
worked hard to define our requirements. We did all these things. We never really asked our customers what they wanted, and we never really thought about how our internal organization can even handle or support this journey that we're on, right? And I think part of that, Kim,
Right.
especially in commerce, happens so often because organizations just think digital commerce is just a channel, right? Like, oh, it's an ordering channel. It's just like the phone or the email. And it's not, right? It's much, much bigger than that. It's very close to what you do with your current sales strategy, right? So when you think of digital commerce, um, when a lot of these organizations are completely structured around their physical channel or their physical go to
Mm-hmm.
market and their traditional ways, right? Their product teams are siloed and all of those things happen. And now when you start taking digital and you start thinking, you know, how do I go to market? Because maybe I
Right.
want to go direct to my customer in a B2B scenario and I don't want to always go through my channel. What does that look like? Well, that starts playing a huge impact on organizations when they do it correctly, right? A lot of companies go into it and they're like, we're just going to try this. And it's kind of like, did you try commerce when you set up your organization originally, or did you take it
Right.
seriously, right? And I think that that's
Right.
the challenge. It's really a lack of understanding of how impactful digital commerce is, right? I mean, it's just, they don't get it.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think you're right. We see people throwing a commerce platform into the mix, and I think sometimes they think, well, let's experiment with it. It's a quick way to get to market and try a few things. But you're right. Inevitably, they're like, oh, wait, this isn't what we thought it would be. And a lot of times when we're working with clients, we back up and say, let's look at your operating model. I mean, we look at more of the top down, like let's see, your B2B example is a really good example because we work with a lot of B2B organizations now that are trying to figure out what that direct to consumer approach should be. And sometimes it's, little d. Sometimes it's a big D, but the realization is like we have to change the way we're operating. Like you said, we can't be as reliant on the physical channels. Or ultimately, a lot of times with B2B organizations, we're looking for ways to leverage existing technologies, leverage existing teams and talent, really taking a closer look at what customers want. In a B2B scenario, both customers and end consumers, what do they want from that digital interaction? And then really look at that digital operating model. And ultimately, we end up making a lot of changes for the good. And I think one of the things I would point out here when it comes to the operating model and sort of this reliance on the physical channels is over half of the time we start working with brands, more traditional B2B brands, and there's initial pushback on going direct to consumer. What we find out and what we're able to convince most of those physically, reliant attitude people on is, with these digital channels, with these digital tools, let's say the salesperson, you're still gonna get to talk to your customers, but you're gonna be able to spend a lot more time talking about valuable things. You're not just placing an order for them. You're able to talk to them about new products and services and how to, expand their assortment or target their customers better. And once they have that realization, that sort of what's in it for me, it's like a light bulb goes off and they're like, oh, this is great. Okay.
Right. How many
ready to go.
hours? I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations that I know we've had with clients, right? How many hours do your high value resources spend doing really low value tasks? Like chasing down an order, finding out when it's going to be delivered, right? Like silly things that are so, I shouldn't say easy to solve because there's always work to be done. But when you think about freeing that high value resource up to do high value things, all of a sudden your opportunities for revenue growth really go up, right? Regardless of if it's direct to a consumer or if it's direct to a customer, right? It doesn't matter. The opportunities for revenue growth are so significant. And then the other things that I always think about, Kim, when we think about strategy is like a salesperson, right? And I've been a B2B salesperson, right? I carried a bag, I did demos, I did all of that work in my career. And one of the things is there's no way for me as an individual person making calls to hit the number of my customers that I can with a digital solution supporting me, right? And then the second piece is, how do you present products, right? Like there's a lot of salespeople that I work with, this is one of my favorite lines, is who would do the show up and throw up, right? Like they would throw everything new on the table and say, anything look interesting? Well, that's not valuable to a client, right? It's just not.
Right.
So now I think about how you can use digital to introduce new products, to highlight new products, to if somebody searches for something and you're like, oh, how about this? Or here's some related products, or did you know you need this? There's so many opportunities to get that conversation started. And then the more complex products are, it's the ability for those people, high value resources, to come in when they can provide the most value, right? Like,
Exactly.
I mean, it's just such a great scenario when you really think about it that way in that scenario.
Right. And that takes a lot of change management, I'll say. When you think about the overall strategy and how you start rolling out content in commerce and driving those digital channels, like I said before, it's about people and processes. It's not about the technology. But a lot of times, I think what we end up talking about is with our clients is, well, what's the once we get past the strategy is a dirty word. What's the difference between strategy and execution? Like, why can't I do both? And the reality is you can. We talk about it being a very symbiotic relationship. You ultimately, you get into execution and realize it might not be working. You might not be realizing the results that you were hoping for. So you can take a step back and think a little more strategically and tweak. Or, these days, we really advise against any kind of 3-year roadmap because things change too frequently.
Right.
So it's fine, to have a longer term view. But what we're really looking at is here's the next 12 to 18 months.
Right.
With some clear milestones on when we're, looking at the results so that we can change the strategy behind the execution if we need to. So it's, it's not a black and white issue. It never was. And I think it sort of gets a bad rap, between strategy and execution on how you think about those things. They're certainly not mutually exclusive.
They're not. And when I think about it, Kim, I think there's a good reason where strategy has gotten a bad rap, right? Because there are strategies that are very, very, very high level and that are not necessarily actionable without additional work, right? We see that a lot. I mean, how many clients come to us and say, we worked with so-and-so and we got a 4-inch binder with all these things, but nothing is really telling us what to do next or what to do first. Right. And so when we think about strategy, a big part of it is how do we make it actionable? And to your point, executable. And a lot of times with commerce, strategy is really running, hand in hand with requirements gathering and thinking about a build, right? But we talk a lot about, there's a client that I'm working with right now, right? And they need to get up quickly because they've been really given this initiative is that we need to move quickly. We've tried commerce. Mm-hmm. We haven't done it well. We're going to move it up in the organization to a new level. We're going to think about it differently. And strategy is a big part of it, right? And one of the things is they've never really thought about audience definition or how do we really know our customers and what they want, right? But they don't want to wait for, to do a full audience definition. And there's ways to make that work, right? There's ways to do that full audience definition as an example, really do the voice of customer, talk to your employees and get that information, develop your personas and your buying journeys, empathy maps, right? Think about all the things you make your customers do that they don't want to do. And still build requirements at the same time. And then what we do is that in this example is we're just going to go back with all these customers we've talked to. We're going to validate. So these are the requirements we've gathered. Do these align to your expectations? Where do we need to adjust? And then use that to keep going, but still be able to do that strategic work in parallel with that build work. And there are a lot of ways to do that, right? We are all about execution, right? We need to execute on a continuous basis. And no company is going to wait to do all the internal work that needs to be done and talk to their customers before they do anything, right? Because they're going to fall, to your point, they're going to fall really far behind because things are moving so incredibly fast today.
Yeah. Yeah. Usually what we're talking about is a test and learn, I would say program, but usually it's actually more of a culture. How do we instill this culture of test and learn and agility? I know it sounds so cliche, but we would always recommend not just building, but that doesn't mean, like you're saying, wait a year to gather all the requirements and vet them. Get a little experiment up. I think these days, most organizations have some notion or some platform that can support A/B testing, even at a very minimal level. Those kinds of things are really helpful in digital channels. A lot of experimentation in your paid media programs is very helpful in, understanding what different audience segments respond to, what they don't respond to, and new audience discovery. And if you're working with a good partner, they can build a program so that you really do test and learn versus let something run. And at the end of the year, you're like, oh, that's not what we expected. Why did we spend so much money on that? But that's really what we're advocating for these days, especially when it comes to content and commerce.
Right, because it's so important. And when you start talking about, the content and commerce, you're bringing a lot of different pieces of your organization together, right? So now you're bringing your marketing, marketing, you're building your sales or your digital sales, however that fits into your organization. And it's different in every company of where these activities
Right.
necessarily fit, but you're definitely bringing more of your organization together when you start talking about content and commerce, right? Because now you're saying, let's market and let's be able to align our sales to that buying journey. And so
Right.
now you're like, at that moment of interaction, we want to capture the customer. We want them to be able to convert whatever that conversion is for us, right? And conversions are different. Everybody's goals and objectives are different, but you're absolutely right, and that's where that internal organizational alignment is such a key, right? One of the clients that I recently talked to, you know, there's so many things they want to do, right? There's industries that they want to go after that currently, because of the way their organization is siloed, um, they can't. And the way their ERP is set up, they can't because it's siloed as well, right? So they have these different sales groups and you can't cross them. And when we start thinking about that, it's a challenge, right? So then it's like, okay, but when we start looking at industry opportunities and being able to example sell products to an industry across all these silos, there's strategic elements that need to take place, right? And there's often
Right.
internal roadblocks that we have to
Right.
overcome in order to be able to get the company to do that. But the reality is there's always ways. But if you say I'm going to wait until my data 100% supports it, or I can get all these changes made in my ERP, it's not going to happen, right? So to your point, it's all about execution and alignment and moving forward. At the same time, you're also addressing these roadblocks that are going to come up along the way within your organization.
Yeah. So, Karie, when we're talking about commerce, no organization would call themselves a commerce company. It's a channel, and there's a much bigger picture. And content needs to enable certainly the digital channels these days. So, how do you feel strategy applies to this content and commerce conversation?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, Kim. It really hits strategy in a lot of different ways, because so many times organizations are looking to they may have a brand site, right? And they may have a separate commerce site today. And they do that for a lot of reasons, right? It may be a manufacturer that sells consumer goods, but they go through retail today. And they're concerned about channel conflict, and they didn't want to create any tension. And now they're recognizing,
Right.
hey, as a manufacturer, I need to get closer to the customer, right? If I let my
Right.
channel
Right.
own that relationship, I don't have that direct relationship, and I need it. And I believe that every company needs to have that relationship, even if they fulfill through a channel. It doesn't matter. As a manufacturer, you need to know who your customers are, what they want, what they need, and you need to own that research journey, right? And then the fulfillment is another piece. So we have a lot of conversations around that, right? What does that mean to your organization? How do you really own that content journey? And then what does fulfillment look like, right? Because fulfillment can be managed in a lot of different ways. So one of the big strategic discussions we have when companies are talking about content and commerce is kind of how they go to market, right? Do you want to disrupt your existing channel, or are you looking to enable? Because you can do both, right? There's technologies that support where that fulfillment happens. So we see a lot of organizations who say we want to own the research journey. We want people to convert and think about buying when they're in the moment. And then who fulfills? It could be you as the manufacturer. It could be your channel partners who are your fulfillment. And it really has a lot to do with that. Like I said, what do you want to disrupt or enable? And there's
Right.
lots of ways to handle this. We have a lot of conversations around what are your go-to-market opportunities? What are you currently doing today? What are your opportunities for the future, right? Are there markets today that are underserved, right? We see a lot of that, especially when you're talking about things like parts. There can be underserved markets. There can be products. We're seeing more and more organizations talk about what if we create our own products that we're going to sell direct to a consumer or direct to a customer.
Right.
That's still different
Right.
from what we sell through our traditional B2B. So there's a lot of strategy that's happening around what are we just trying to accomplish, right? And then the content piece of that, like I talked about, is very big around what information do customers need in every stage of their journey, right? And it's different. You
Right.
know that. We talk about this a lot. When I'm ready to make a decision about a buy, I need a lot more information that's very relevant to where I am on my journey, which is very different from awareness. So
Right.
content plays a huge role, whether it's product information, right, product content, or if it's supporting marketing content. They really go hand in hand when we really look at the buying journey today. So that's a really big piece of the conversations that we have around strategy as it relates to content and commerce, as an example. And obviously there's a lot more, but those are some of the common discussions that we have. And then we also get into who owns the experience at what time in the journey, right?
Right.
That's a big
And
one
that
when
can
we're
be controversial.
it's
Yes,
very
right.
controversial, right? When do you
Uh,
stop marketing, right? And so we talk a lot about it from a technical side is glass ownership, but you're really talking about who owns that who is really responsible for that interaction and the content
Right.
that's being presented at that moment in time. And it's different for every organization, but we also talk about how the experience changes, right? It's getting very common in content and commerce where when they start getting into those product information pages and really getting into product details, that there's no marketing happening, right? The header and the footer
Right.
completely changes. And we don't, why? Because we don't want to distract them from converting. We want them to purchase when they're in that moment. So there's so many content decisions that have to be made and so many different levels, Kim, when we're talking about content and commerce and strategy.
Yeah, I think you're making me remember some more painful experiences. And again, with more traditional B2B or branded manufacturers who have both, customers, but also consumers. And when we would talk to both of those, larger cohorts, what we often found to your point is their customer would say, I'm looking at all this product information on my, buying portal. It's lacking, it's cryptic, there's no inventory visibility, there's no ATP, like I'm missing all this information. But when I go to the consumer site, it has everything I'm looking for, including inventory visibility. And so I think it goes back to, like you said, we've been talking a lot about in the strictly strategy world across industries, across verticals, is how do you be customer centric?
Yep.
Big C, little c. And the reality is you have to be customer centric in order to answer some of these questions as it relates to the content and commerce conversation we're having today. But I think a lot of organizations still just don't get it.
Mhm.
Saying, well, we can't do this because our ERP is structured this way. We can't do this because our teams are siloed this way. What we would really advocate again is looking at that operating model, and maybe you're turning it on its, side a little bit to say, no, now you have one merchandising group. You don't have 12 by product assortment and by channel. You have one that looks across that buying journey, for the customer who's going
Right.
to buy this assortment. And I've heard, and I don't quite get this, I've heard a lot of leaders in the past year say things like, well, omni-channel is a dirty word, or I don't want to hear that word again. And I, I don't get it. I'll be honest with you. I just think I get the notion that maybe it's a little cliche, and maybe there have been some failures in executing on an omni-channel vision. That doesn't mean omni-channel isn't needed, necessary, and demanded by your customers today. And that just belies kind of the question, are you really as customer centric as you
Right.
think you are? Do you really know your customer the way you think you do? And there are lots of, like you're saying, tactics to figure out what you know and what you don't know. But I think that's kind of the biggest, I would say, mistake that we see in organizations today is they really don't know what their customers want and need because they don't talk to them enough. That's really the bottom line.
I think the reality is what you said is so important, right? I think a lot of companies today don't even have a clear definition of who their customer is, right?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
that is confusing in itself, right? because
Yes.
your channel, in a B2B scenario, your channel is your customer, and their
Right.
needs are very specific. And so many companies that we talk to say, well, we know what they want. Do you? Because they are changing, right? They're changing to be digital
Right.
obsessed customers as well as your consumer, as your direct customer. And so you have to really think about everything. And it's interesting to me how many companies dismiss that, but then come back and say, we don't know what our customers want, regardless of who they are.
Right.
We don't have a good
Right.
definition of who our customers are and how they are the same and different, how where they're the same and where they're different, where they converge and diverge, right? And I think to your
Right.
point, Kim, um, that's where we make a lot of mistakes. And that's where we dismiss things that are so critical, right? Because a direct customer has very specific needs. But even the individuals within their companies have distinct needs. A finance person
Right.
doesn't need
Right.
the same experience that a buyer does, or somebody who's a subject
Right.
matter expert, right? An engineer who's researching a new piece of equipment they want to build at an OEM is so different from a consumer, right? And all of those
Right.
people, but they're still people. And I think that where we're starting to see things change is getting into a little bit more of kind of thinking about governance, right? Like, instead of having
Yes.
these having commerce as an example reside within these silos, we're really starting to see companies elevate that into a higher level above the
Right.
silos. I've actually seen companies spin off and create a new company that allows them to have no barriers and go completely digital and not have to deal with any of the legacy history
Yes.
that comes with the
Yeah.
organization, right? So I
That's
think
a
that
very valid model. Yeah.
when we're talking about this, there's so many different ways that businesses need to think. But you're right. Understanding your customers is critical. And then how do you make your internal organization become customer obsessed to be able to deliver on those expectations, right? That's a big
Right.
piece. We talk a lot about the customer and what they need, but organizations aren't necessarily aligning to those customer expectations and how the digital customer is changing, regardless of who they are. And I know we talk about
Right.
that a
Right.
lot, right?
Well, yes, and that's one of my favorite topics du jour. Um, I'm working on a position, and based on the reality of what we've all been through with the pandemic, all around employee experience. And my thesis is really you can't have good customer experience without a good employee experience. And that's a very broad statement, but I think if anyone watching this video hears that, they probably think of 10 things like, oh my gosh, yeah, okay, here's how, my workforce could be better enabled to serve, the customer that ladders up to the strategy. And it just goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. When we talk about technology and enabling technologies, and let's use content and commerce as an example. You typically have a commerce platform, you might have a CMS, you might have a PIM. Sometimes you're missing one or two of those, but generally there's some supporting platforms that are brought into the mix. But very often we see that as those technologies are implemented, there isn't attention paid to how the teams are really going to use those tools. So even getting away from the word technology, but it's like, oh, you have all these great tools now that come with, let's say, an integration between a commerce platform and a CMS. Like I mentioned before, you might even have some A/B testing capabilities. You might have some different targeting capabilities. You have abilities to have multiple views of, products and specs and documentation, and you have all these things that come along with it that you didn't have before. And I think it's one thing to say, okay, we'll retrain our teams on how to use those new tools and have some new processes. That's great. But what about all the content production needed to support all these enabling technologies. Like you kind of follow that stream down to how it's getting created, on one end of the spectrum, and then how it's getting consumed on the other end of the spectrum. And it really can be disruptive in a bad way. Like do we have the right people? Do we have the right skill sets? Have we really enabled our teams to use these tools in service of that desired customer experience? So we talk a lot about now today, not only customer centricity and how to be customer centric, but it's okay, how do you support that with a good employee experience? And what does that mean? And we're finding, I know this is going off the content and commerce topic a little bit, but it's related. What we're finding is a lot of companies don't know. They don't even know what a good employee experience looks like in their companies. So they're having to take another step back and say, okay, wait a minute. We need to retain our great, workforce. We need to reskill them, retrain them. We need to help them understand what it means to be customer centric. And that's, I think, what is going to, at this moment in time, catapult good organizations to great organizations.
Right.
Especially when it comes to, this merging of content and commerce and how to start thinking about really leveraging digital channels.
But I have a great example of that, right? So an organization is totally looking at content and commerce. They've invested in PIM. They recognize that they need an enterprise DAM and how important DAM is with PIM, right? Because all those product assets need to go somewhere. And in often cases,
Right.
they're all over the organization. There's no standardization, tying back to governance, right? Tying back to process. But the interesting thing is they have invested in the right technologies, right? And did they have gaps? Absolutely. But what's really interesting, Kim, is that what we found is that people in the organization found that the technology, they didn't understand the purpose. They didn't understand the value.
Right.
And
right,
so
right.
they felt like their jobs were difficult because of these tools, and that they started doing things outside of the tools
Yes.
because in their mind it made their jobs easier. And right, so the reality is you have a great tool. The tool's not configured correctly to really support the work that the internal employees need to do, so they're not using it. And the reality is what happens is customers had very disconnected experiences. The information
Yep.
they had was inconsistent depending on, again, using the term omnichannel, which channel they were part of, right? And
Right.
and
Right.
so the investment in the technology was great. And then when they set products up coming out of development, there was always the same mistake made over and over and over. And rather than fixing
Right.
it, they would do the same thing. And then everybody down chain would do the same thing. And we're kind of like, stop. So when you think about content and commerce, the information that's in your PIM is key to the experience your customers have with your products. And if you have multiple channels, right, you have a B2B channel, you have a B2C channel, you have a D2C channel, whatever your interaction is, that product information, again, if you want to own that experience, that information is critical, right? How you keyword it, how you use it, how you enrich it. And so it's all of this is directly behind the scenes related to those experiences. And then when you talk about content and commerce, right, that's why we're starting to see more and more DXP, those experience platforms come out. Yep. Because they're designed to do this multi-channel experience, your employee experience as opposed to your channel experience, as opposed to your consumer experience. So when you start seeing organizations really grow and mature and look at content and commerce as an example, the technologies alone are not going to work, right? If you don't get your employees on board on what you're trying to do and why it's important. I think you made a point early in the discussion, Kim, is every person I know, every employee I've ever met believes they are customer centric, right? Like they want to do what's right for the customer, right? I've never had anybody tell me they don't. But I think the
Right.
reality is that digital changes what that is. And then you get
Mm-hmm.
into, if this change impacts my job, am I still relevant? Right? So all of these
Yes.
other feelings and emotions start coming into these discussions that really are part of strategy, right? And we
Yeah.
look at it very holistically because of that. So content and commerce, right, is can look like a very small thing. Like, oh, you're picking a CMS or a DXP and you're picking a commerce platform and you're connecting it to your PIM and your DAM and
Yeah.
your ERP and away you go. And then but the reality is it impacts and touches every piece of an organization, and it's one small example of digital, right? And how it impacts an
Right.
entire entity and culture of an organization.
That's right. I couldn't have said it better. I think about these key takeaways, and I know it's kind of content and commerce, but when it relates to strategy, in my mind, the key takeaways are, strategy and execution can happen at the same time.
Right.
They really are different work streams and one kind of team force. I think when we're talking about content and commerce specifically, it's really not enabling technologies, but the people and the processes really need to be taken account for in any implementation to make it successful. And I think that's what you and I do every day. We want these projects to be successful, so we're asking these kinds of questions and kind of raising our hands when we're not seeing that certain things haven't been considered. And then I think just really specifically employee experience. And you drill down, like you're saying, the last thing you want is your team to be demoralized because they're having to do all these workarounds and not seeing the benefits of these great tools, not understanding why they have to change, not understanding why these investments were made when maybe in their mind they're like, well, why didn't we invest in this instead? I think that's so critical right now at this point in time as well, is making sure you're bringing your teams along. But I feel like those were my biggest takeaways. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. And I think the takeaways that I really want people to think about in content and commerce or any digital, but relative to content and commerce, is that
Yeah,
strategy is part of everything you're thinking about. And don't be afraid by the term strategy, right? Strategy can
right,
be a lot of different things, and
right,
strategy has changed so much, but it is part of content and commerce, right? Thinking about your competition, your market strategy, everything that's happening, and where you want to go, right? What do you want to do today and what do you want to do in the future? Because it's really thinking about, I think of strategy today a lot more about foundation. So that's one big takeaway, right? Is I believe strategy is
great.
part of building a
Yes,
solid foundation. And then
right,
the second piece of that is that understanding everything there is about your customers is critical. It doesn't mean you stop, but you have to really think about who your customers are and all of your customers and how their
right.
expectations are different. And you can say you don't like omni-channel. The reality is customers interact and are touched by many different things within an
That's right.
organization in many different ways, but it all connects to the same thing in the end, right? And then the
Yeah,
internal, you mentioned employees, right? That operation process, your employees, that internal piece of your organization is such a critical part of this. And then think about your technologies not as the leading, but as the enabler, right? If you think about
right.
strategy, customers, your internal organization enabling an obsession about customer obsession, and then how technology enables that, organizations can be very successful, right? And you don't have to do all of them at one at a time to get somewhere. You can do bits and
Right,
pieces,
right.
right? And that you can always come back. And just like we put strategy towards the end of our whole content and commerce series, is because it's never too late to say we want to go back and think strategically, whatever that may look like. So to me, those are four big takeaways, Kim, and we talked about all of them throughout this series, that organizations just need to think differently about strategy and their organization and digital as a whole.
Yeah. No, very well said. It's not too late. It's not too late.
Never, never too late.
Well, thanks, Karie, for having me. It was great talking to you as always.
Thanks, Kim. It was a great conversation. I love these conversations, as you know. So.